Thank you very much for the very flattering introduction. And thank you all for being here. I am truly honored by your presence. I know you have lots of other things to do with your life, and it really is especially flattering to me that you all would take the time tonight to be here with me. I do have prepared remarks. I hate doing prepared remarks, but I promise the people who worry about me having absolutely unconstrained time for an hour that I would do my prepared remarks, and then I'll be unconstrained with the Q&As. Let me say, if you don't already know this, that I'm an economist about the U.S. economy and more broadly about the U.S. society, and I'd like to tell you why. In 1977, after working for the federal government for 15 years, as Mike has said, I moved to the private sector, affording me a front row perspective on the U.S. economy and on many other countries of the world economy as a product supplier. Let me remind you of the circumstances then. At that time and through the early 1980s, our situation was characterized by a struggling economy. Relatively high unemployment rates, high inflation, and high interest rates, and a general sense that we were being eclipsed by Japan and that Russia was probably our equal. If you fast forward to today and look back, you see a U.S. economy that has had a remarkable period of income and productivity growth, while Japan has now had 11 years of average growth of less than 1%, and Russia's economy, by their own reckoning, is the size of Portugal's. Why the change? We have an enabling economic structure, not perfect, but as compared to other economies, it is truer to the fundamentals that are necessary to economic growth and rising living standards. Our government system provides the rule of law, enforceable contracts, and minimal corruption, buttressed by a relative openness to world competition and flexibility in our labor markets. On a broader front, the complexity of our tax code is a takeaway from our economic potential. Estimates of how much taxpayers spend complying with the tax code range from $70 to $125 billion a year. That's a lot of lawyers and accountants. The cost of their service has to be included in the price of products. I wonder how many of you think your food tastes better, or your car performs better, or your clothes fit better because of the added cost you pay to cover the cost of lawyers and accountants figuring out the tax code. Now, at the be careful. At the reception, I met lots of CPAs and lawyers. And so I want to give you my apologies and say it would be great to have the need for a federal retraining program to convert you into product engineers. We at the Treasury are conducting a comprehensive review of the tax laws and their complexities and the options for fixing some of the biggest headaches. We'll begin releasing these reports in the coming months. Did you know, for example, that there are 5 different definitions of a child in the tax code? You think it'd be easy to know if you have a child living in your household. Guess again. You know, this is really an egregious case, and it's in a way it's a heartbreaking case because the most complicated definition of what a child is in the tax code is the definition that has to be dealt with by people who are filing a return for an earned income tax credit. This is for a benefit for people who have low, and in most cases very low incomes, and they're presented with a definitional problem in the tax code that the Commissioner of Revenue, Charles Rosati, who's a super intelligent person, says if he had to fill out the form, he would need legal assistance. That tells you something about the task that we have in front of us. And I think it also makes a really important point that there are real people out there who suffer the consequences of this unbelievable complexity. As another example, take a look at the provisions that allow for deducting different higher education expenses, or all of the different rules and requirements for various types of retirement savings. And it's not just individuals who suffer either. Small business people have to read through indecipherable rules determining whether someone who works for you is an independent contractor or an employee can be an incredible headache. Small business people spend countless hours battling the IRS over timing of a deduction, not whether or not the cost can be deducted, just whether the deduction should be taken this year or next. You know, I've been saying quite a while now, and let me say it to you, our tax code is an abomination. And it's a drag on our ability to create jobs in this nation. We hope that by publishing detailed descriptions of these complexities, we can begin a cooperative effort with the Congress to undo some of the complexities that give individuals headaches and force small business to pay for tax advice instead of expanding their businesses and creating jobs. Think about that for a minute, and you understand who pays the interest cost in a society for sovereign debt. You're quick to know that it's the people who pay for everything that the government does, right? So we're out there kind of going along with the notion that 18 or 20 or 25% interest rates are okay. It's really not okay, because it is the most horrible tax on the people as compared to what it could be if they were running balanced books, albeit at low levels. Now, you know, we have in a way conspired with what we've done in the name of economic development. We've created loan programs so that for low-income and developing countries for 50 years or so, we've been giving them highly concessionary loans, but nevertheless it goes into their loan base, and we have contributed to, I think, a continuous situation of no improvement in many of the low-income and underdeveloped world economies. In fact, there are countries in the world today that are worse off now from a per capita income level than they were 40 years ago. Now that suggests to me there's some learning that we need to do with our International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And so it's true I've been critical, and I have asked the World Bank to prepare a report that draws all the lessons of all the great things that we have done where we've had real successes and all of the horrible examples where we haven't had successes, because I do believe as we go forward, we in the developed world are going to have to put more resources forward, but I don't think people in the United States and most other developed countries are going to put more money forward until they believe people in leadership positions can tell the difference between success and failure. And because we've not been very charmed by the idea of pointing out failure and calling it by its right name and learning from it, I think we've disabled our ability to command more resources to work on these problems. Now, to the question of Argentina, if I just can do this very quickly. Argentina has a system at the federal level that permits the provinces, their equivalent of our states, to create financial obligations for the national polity without reference to the national polity. It's a little bit like having a bank account and giving 100 people you don't know a credit card to draw on, and you're responsible for the bills. Now, I would say one of the things that would be useful for them to do is change that practice. As an example, they have a tax system that's collecting maybe 60% of what they need to service their outstanding debt. That's a problem. I mean, these are not too hard, right? These are real things, and I tell you, it's heartbreaking to look at the images on television of people rioting in the streets of Buenos Aires. If you've ever been there, Argentina is a lovely country, and the people are great people. And one would wish there were some other way to get at this problem. But let me remind you very quickly of the circumstances. In the last couple of months of the Clinton administration, they agreed with the IMF to a program that had a nominal value of IMF and private sector funds of $43 billion. And in April of last year, that was all gone, and we agreed rather reluctantly to a refreshed program of another 20, and by August that was gone, and we agreed to 8 more and said that's it. That we're not going to do more until there's fundamental change made. And they have now gone through 4 or 5 governments in rapid succession. President Dualde and his cabinet seem headed in the right direction. We're spending lots of time engaged with them to see if we can't help them determine the basis for sustainability, which means then we can go in with some confidence that if they get more money, they will have a sustainable program. And as I'm fond of saying, we won't be sending the money of the plumbers and carpenters in Chicago who make $50,000 a year, 15 of it a year, to Washington. We won't be sending it a place where it's not treated well.
The Republic of Turkey is facing serious economic strains, which remind some observers of Argentina. How far will the Bush administration go to support a nation which is our NATO ally and the leading democracy in the Islamic world?
The situation in Turkey is different. Again, when we arrived in January a year ago, I guess I would say Turkey and Argentina were in some ways equivalent. The thing that happened in Turkey that was very important, and it was in a way an early win, was we worked with the IMF, and the IMF insisted that before they sent more money to Turkey, that they would have to take 16 different actions that were, believe me, very difficult to do in their political environment before any more money went to Turkey. And they did the 16. You know, they still have a very difficult situation. The shot that they took to their tourist trade after September of the 11th was important to them because they do have a strong tourist economy. But we and the IMF are hopeful about the progress that they're making, and I truly do believe it is a different situation than the one that we see in Argentina.
In the current climate, there is rising concern about the political stability of Saudi Arabia and the potential for disruption of crude supply and energy prices. How would the Bush administration respond to such contingencies?
Well, I said very briefly in my prepared remarks, the President has put together a complete energy plan that I think is the best plan going, that would cause us to develop our own resources, cause us to employ more energy efficient technologies. And I think this is the way of our future. You know, I guess I frankly have this concern that I'll share with you. We've had this problem now for a long time. I remember the first energy shocks, as many of you probably do, in the 70s, and we knew we needed to do something. And we did remarkably improve our energy efficiency in this country, but we never really put together a full-fledged, dedicated energy plan to assure the energy future for our society. It's a piece of business waiting and wanting to be done. And, you know, as hard as it is to get our society to move when the threat is distant, it really is important in this area that we take a preemptive action.
It's been reported that you recommend that CEOs certify that financial statements give an accurate snapshot of their company's condition, and that CEOs should be personally liable for damages without resorting to corporate insurance if statements are misleading. Would you comment on this recommendation?
Well, again, let me start at the top. For me, this is a value proposition. You know, I think our society depends on certain conventions. We need to be able to trust each other. You know, to use a simple example, when you pull up to an intersection and the light is green on your side, you need to be able to expect that the people on the other side of the intersection who have a red light stop. I mean, it's a really simple proposition, but many of you, like I, have traveled around the world. That isn't true lots of places. You get killed following traffic lights, right? But we have taken this basic idea of individual freedom and the rights and responsibility that goes with individual freedom, and as best I can tell, we've done a better job of perfecting it than any other place in the world. And I really do believe, something the President said really captured this beautifully when he talked about cleaning up and improving 401k and pension protections. The President said, I always thought it was sailors first, captain last. Well, I believe that. I really do believe people who are given trust, who are given high responsibility, have a duty. They have a duty to those they would lead, and to those whose money, in the case of a corporation, to those whose money they would use for their business enterprise. They have a duty to tell the truth, and to tell all of the truth, so that it's not okay to live by omission. And I do think that out of some of these unfortunate recent events, that there is some learning to do. In this sense, if you look, those of you who know annual reports and statements from CEOs, you look at those and you say, well, they're already certifying. But if you look carefully at what they're certifying, they're basically certifying that they use generally accepted accounting principles. And the auditors they're seconding the motion. This company used generally accepted accounting principles. Well, that would all be fine if we had rule makers who could imagine every permutation and combination that a brilliant financial engineer could imagine in order to make a decision about whether to rule it in or out of bounds before anyone is faced with a decision. Obviously, we all know that's not true. It's not possible to do that. It's not possible for one human mind to define a set of systems that will ensure people who have wrongful intent won't do wrongful things. So I think it's an important line to draw, and if that's right, if you don't want to turn our world over to cops, in effect, who are looking over your shoulder to everything you do, you've got to say the person with a responsibility has got to also be accountable and has a duty. And therefore, I would have CEOs certify, I know all the important things, and here they are. They're available for everyone. Now, some of my friends have said, God, I'm glad I'm eligible to retire because I'd hate to live under your system. I don't think they really mean it. When they look at their big bucks, they probably change their mind. But by calling for this a change in standard, I'm not saying that CEOs can or should know everything that can happen in their enterprise. If there's a wrongdoer, then let's say an environmental engineer who goes off on their own tangent and fails to properly report samples from a stream of water or something, that's not something that's really knowable by a CEO. As soon as it comes to the CEO's attention, I think CEO has a duty to report it to lawful officials and take remedial action. That's not what I mean. Some have tried to trivialize my idea by saying, oh, well, it's simply not possible for one human being or one CEO to know everything, and that's right. But I'm not talking about knowing everything. I'm talking about knowing if you've got huge numbers or even one off-balance sheet entity that's financially important. If you don't know it, I don't think you ought to be there. And if you do know it and you don't report it, I don't think you ought to be there.
You are a strong supporter of markets setting exchange rates, and good companies can manage through any exchange rate environment. The Midwest is an extremely export-dependent part of the country, and the extraordinary strength of the dollar has hurt the heavy manufacturing sector disproportionately. When would a currency intervention be justified? Are we at risk for a sharp downward movement in the dollar anytime soon?
That's a really fun question. For those of you in the financial community who work on and read about these things every day, you will know that when I came into office, I had lots of good people, including Michelle Davis, who's here with me tonight, and others who work with me, to say, you got to remember you can never talk about exchange rates. I've been ramming around the world talking about what I thought were important things for a long time. I couldn't understand their concern about me saying what I thought about exchange rates. And so I didn't. That was really a mistake. Not because what I said was wrong, but because there are certain conventions that exist in the world that I frankly do not understand this one, which says we have to talk to each other in code about this. In fact, it's dangerous for me to even have said what I already did. Because tomorrow morning, or maybe even tonight, because the world is round now and people are making exchange rate investments 24 hours a day, someone may deduce that I laid down a new policy out of what I just said to you, and it will cause gyrations in the foreign exchange community. It's just a lament of what it's like to be in the news, I suppose. But let me address the question more directly with a question. I wonder if there's anyone here who's studied the subject, I'm sure some of you have, who can point me to a set of facts that suggest intervention works. If you'd like to talk to me after, that would be okay. Thank you.
Paul, I want to assure you, whenever anyone at the Federal Reserve is asked about exchange rates, we say that's Treasury's responsibility. Is there a role for the U.S. government in restructuring the U.S. steel industry? Should steel exports or imports be more regulated or less regulated?
We've had, I would say, a 40-year period now where the number of companies in the worldwide steel industry who've returned the cost of capital can be counted on one hand in an industry where there are hundreds of companies. And, if you're analytic, you ask yourself the question, why is that? And there are a number of different reasons, but the most important reason is the world has a 35 or maybe even 40% too much steel capacity. And in most industries, that problem gets taken care of, in the U.S. at least, because companies who don't earn the cost of capital go out of business. And in fact, I think it's true right now, we have 27 steel companies in some state of bankruptcy. But it's something that's been happening for a long time. As a resident of Pittsburgh for 13 years, I can be a personal witness to what it means for an industry to evaporate in a town that grew up on it. The consequences for individual people are really terrible and severe. And so when we came in, it was clear that this subject was going to be on the agenda, and we set out to do something different. We set out to create a worldwide perspective of this problem and caused to be put together, forgive me for the technical terms, but a worldwide supply cost curve that looked at the economic fundamentals of every steel producing plant in the whole world in an attempt to show where the high cost, noxious capacity wasn't. By noxious, I mean places with no environmental controls at all, doing damage to the human beings that worked in them and to their environment, and to look at their costs. And then we asked the OECD to sponsor a meeting to bring all the world's steel producers together with the thought that if we could get everybody to look at these facts at the same time, maybe we could figure out a way individually and together to fashion something that looked like a longer run solution than what we've been doing for the last 40 years, which is from time to time imposing quotas and tariffs in order to protect domestic industry in the U.S. and in every other country around the world. And once and for all get ourselves into a condition where there was a reasonable balance between supply and demand so that the industry could go forward in some reasonable kind of way. There have now been 3 meetings of this group. In the meantime, a 201 action was filed. Those of you in the trade community know what that means. And on March the 6th, the president's going to have to make a decision whether to impose any kind of a tariff or duty on steel coming into this country. It's a complicated problem for this reason. It used to be that in the U.S. we had a completely integrated industry, which means people did everything from dig up the iron ore to rolling steel into finished shapes. It's changed a lot in the last 40 or 50 years, and we now have steel manufacturing process that depends on imports of steel from Brazil and other places around the world. So that if we just did a blanket, a barrier, we would disable a substantial fraction of the most competitive part of the U.S. industry. On the other hand, we have a scrap-based part of the industry that's Nucor and a similar kind of companies that don't need any import material. So we've got a very complicated problem. We're trying to weave our way through it. And on the other end, avoid a finding by the antitrust authorities that we're violating the antitrust laws, either here or in Europe or someplace else around the world, but still keep pushing toward a North Star that creates the possibility of a vibrant industry again, which we haven't now seen for 40 years.
Paul, you had an outstanding record in private industry at Alcoa and International Paper, but no experience on Wall Street or the financial service industry. In addition, some have criticized the Treasury Department for its lack of Wall Street representation. What can the Treasury Department do to compensate for this?
Well, some of these are really tempting to laugh out loud, but I won't do. You know, one of the things that I found, I was the chief financial officer of International Paper before I was president of International Paper Company, and I came to, you know, I went to Wall Street and worked with them and did all kinds of deals with financially engineered instruments that were new for their time, and I thought I knew a little bit about the subject, but you know, since I didn't have a residential address there, I guess it didn't count. But I tell you what I found, you know, I have lots of people that I've worked with over the years in Wall Street and in the financial community, and they have been wonderfully supportive and a great resource for me and for my associates in the Treasury Department. I guess it goes without notice, some of the people that we have at the Treasury. The Undersecretary of Treasury for Domestic Finance is one Peter Fisher, who I would say, with some assistance, but with Peter in the lead, solved the long-term capital problem when it threatened our world, both the U.S. and the world capital markets. And we have dozens of people like this in the Treasury Department who understand the nuances and have a sandpapered fingertip feeling for what's going on. And I would warrant this to you, and I would set myself aside in saying this. I think we've assembled the finest, most talented group of people in the Treasury Department ever, including a great friend of mine, Deputy Secretary Kenneth Dam, who's from Chicago. Some of you, many of you may know Kenneth Dam. There is no finer public servant. He was Deputy Secretary of State under George Shultz. He's a colleague of mine from the early 1970s when he came to Washington to redesign the intelligence agencies of the government. I thought so highly of him and his skill level that when I became a chairman of Alcoa, he was the first person I put on my board. And when I was asked by President Bush and Vice President Cheney to become Secretary of the Treasury, I called Ken, frankly, without much hope that he would say yes, and he was quick to say, yes, I will come and help. You know, we are full of people with this kind of talent and skill level, and I'm proud to represent them every day.
Final question. What are the three most important things that you want to accomplish in your tenure as Treasury Secretary?
You know, I know we all have this notion, or at least there's a popular notion, that there's so many things to do in life that you've got to have priorities. You know, it's an idea I've worked really hard to defeat. And I tell you why, because three isn't nearly enough. You know, one of the things that Mike said to you in the beginning about safety is something that has a lot deeper meaning for me, and he conveyed a little bit of that to you. You know, again, I said to you, every place I've traveled in the world, I find people with skill capability to produce value. But I've drawn another lesson from working different ways in different places around the world over the last 40 years. And I've distilled it to what I call my three in common principles that exist all over the world in individual people and among people, and they're this. Every person that I've ever encountered in the world wants to be treated with dignity and respect every day by everyone. And the second thing that I found that people want all over the world, they want to have the tools and training that they need so that they can make a contribution. Here's the important part: that gives meaning to their life. Not to your life or somebody else's life, but the ability to make a contribution that gives meaning to your life, even if people can't explain it to you in those words, they want it. And the other thing that people want all over the world, every place in the world, they want someone to notice they did it. Now, if I could accomplish one thing at the Treasury Department, it would be to so instill in the institution those ideas. That would be enough, because everything else would take care of itself. If everyone could believe and act on the idea, not only that you get dignity and respect every day, but you give it every day, and that you get to make a contribution that gives meaning to your life and someone noticed, I take a pass on everything else.